The image of God that we hear from our first reading is that of a helpless God, a helpless and suffering God. This image is not an invention of Christianity because it is already there in Judaism, right? In the very first book of the Bible, the book of Genesis. Yung narinig natin is from chapter 6, verses 5 to 10, which is the introduction to the popular story of Noah's Ark. You remember that story about the big flood that destroyed the whole world, and no one was saved except Noah and his family. You know, this story is just as scandalous as the later New Testament portrayal of God suffering and dying on the cross like a common criminal in order to redeem the world. Can you imagine God saying to himself sa ating first reading, I will allow them all to be destroyed. I will allow all of them. And he's referring to us, to human beings. I will allow all of them to be destroyed because I am sorry that I even created them at all. Wow. I mean, this is the most shocking passage in the whole Bible, I think. The author says that God's heart was so grieved because humankind had been contaminated with so much evil. They were already on the path of self-destruction. And the author is suggesting that they were all beyond redemption, except for Noah and his family. In the gospel, Jesus is described in almost the same way by the writer. Jesus is also grieved and overwhelmed by his disciples, by their hardness of heart, by their lack of understanding. St. Mark simply says the disciples had forgotten to bring bread, and they had only one loaf of bread with them. You know, ako personally, I suspect na hindi naman nila nakalimutan. They had not really forgotten. They had done it on purpose. Umalis sila, walang dalang tinapay kundi one loaf of bread. That is why Jesus is warning them to guard against the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. Leaven or yeast. You know, if you put a teeny-weeny bit of yeast on a whole mass of dough, paaalsahin niya. It will make the dough rise. And evil works in exactly the same way. You cannot imagine the capacity of evil to corrupt people. I think it was obvious to Jesus that his own apostles were now trying to manipulate him. They did not forget the bread. They brought only one loaf of bread. Sinadya talaga nila. They did it on purpose. And now, nagmamaang-maangan pa sila, as they say in Tagalog, playing innocent, as if they forgot. Well, if with 5 loaves, Jesus fed 5,000 people, and they collected 12 baskets of leftovers, and with just 7 loaves, Jesus fed 4,000 people, and they collected 7 baskets of leftovers. Ilan kaya mapapakain nila with 1 loaf? I think they were curious. Do the mathematics. And I call it the mathematics of deceitfulness. And yet, Jesus does not give up on his disciples. And the twist from the Old Testament to the New Testament is very clear. While before, God allowed humankind to take the path of self-destruction, this time, in the New Testament, God would take the final option for the redemption of humankind. He would not inflict suffering, but take the suffering upon himself. Diba? When he was being arrested by the soldiers at the Garden of Gethsemane, remember what he said to the soldiers? If it is me you're looking for, let these men go and take me in. Wow. What a set of readings for Valentine's Day. But it is the basic Christian statement that the only antidote to evil and its contagion is unconditional love. Learning to love as God has loved us in Jesus of Nazareth. Learning to love in a manner that is ready and willing to suffer and die for the redemption of the beloved, even when they do not deserve it. Alam niyo ba, sabi nila, many of those buildings that collapsed in Turkey and were flattened like pancakes were very obviously substandard. They had been built down by corrupt developers who, for love of money, would economize on stability, tinipid, and they compromised thousands of lives. Many of them have been running away, itong mga developers, running away to escape arrest from authorities. And it is also not far-fetched na yung mga substandard buildings na yon were allowed to be constructed because some government authorities had been bribed. Wow. They all have blood in their hands. And it tells us how rotten to the core some people can get for love of money. Well, I will not end there. May good news naman. And the good news is, God never gives up on us, however rotten we can be. Haven't we heard of the children who survived under the rubble because they were protected by their mothers and their fathers who did not survive? Ang daming nakitang mga bata, alive, but their parents were dead. I think up to the very last moment, they were protecting their children. Haven't we been hearing the news reports about the help that has been pouring into Turkey and Syria? Not through government, but through the initiatives of private citizens and many nameless volunteers from around the world. You see, if evil is contagious, well, the good news is goodness and unconditional love is even more contagious, even more powerful. Kaya the good news is, hindi tayo hopeless. We're not hopeless. We are not a failure after all. And I don't believe that God regrets having created us at all. That, brothers and sisters, is our good news for today.